Okay, so this time we're going to talk about, last time we talked about the liver, and this time we're going to talk about the digestive system, which is multiple different organs, but it's basically the digestive tract functions as a unit in a lot of ways. So we're going to talk about that. And like the liver, it's something which traditional medicine has long recognized, and conventional medicine is kind of catching up to the fact that it's not as simple and mechanistic as it might have originally seemed, or might seem from a cursory examination. So there's a lot to the digestive system besides just food passing through it and getting absorbed, although that is, a really big part of it. And so let's see. Yeah, the digestive system, like I said, involves multiple different phases, and which we're all pretty familiar with, at least somewhat familiar with. But I'm gonna kind of go through it a little bit. There's the process of digestion begins when people start chewing food, breaking it up mechanically into smaller pieces, and mixing it with saliva, which contains enzymes, and then it's swallowed through the esophagus to the stomach, passes from the stomach into the small intestine, which is where most of the absorption happens. And then from there into the large intestine, which absorbs some other nutrients, absorbs some other substances from it, turns it into stool, which is collected in the rectum and then passed out through the anus. And so that's like the kind of general overview of the process. All along that process, there's a lot of nervous system activity going on. There's a lot of sensory stuff. There's a lot of feedback from the digestive system to the rest of the system. There's a lot of nerves around the guts. A lot of the neurotransmitters are produced and used in and around the digestive system. And there are a lot of endocrine and metabolic stuff that goes on by way of the digestive system as well. So it's very involved in the nervous system. It's very involved in the endocrine system, and to a lesser extent, or to maybe not even a lesser extent, but it's also involved in other systems like the circulatory system, which is where the nutrients actually go into the bloodstream. So I don't know about almost all, but in my practice, most of the medicines that I'm using are going into someone's system through their digestive system. There are other modalities where, they focus more on putting things on the skin and inhaling things and things like that. But for the most part, I'm using the digestive system a lot as a route of entry for medicines. And of course, it's the primary or only route of entry for nutrients into the body under normal circumstances. So it's really important in that regard, and it's really complicated. There are at each different stage along the way, there are different substances being produced by the digestive system to work on the food that's been consumed, the material that's in the digestive system at that point. And those are very different from one place to the next. The environment in the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine are all very dissimilar from each other, even though it's the same food passing through these different areas. And so they have valves that separate them, that keep stuff from going backwards, ideally. And all along the digestive system, there's what's called peristalsis, which is just the movement. It's a sort of wave-like movement created by contraction and relaxing of muscles along the digestive system that pushes things downward and forward. Most of the time, of course, there's also vomiting and reflux and things like that can happen, that are stuff moving the other direction. But for the most part, peristalsis is a constant process, like a heartbeat or breathing, that's just sort of going on all the time. It's going on less when you sleep, but it should be going on all the time. And if it's not, that's a problem. It doesn't cause quite as big a problem if you're as if you're breathing or your heartbeat stops, but it's controlled by your autonomic nervous system. It's not something you have to really think about. It just sort of happens on its own for the most part. And it's, also because it's involved, the nervous system is involved. That's involved in, it's tied in with your circadian rhythms when you're awake and when you're asleep. It's tied in with appetite and things of that sort too. So it's a very well-connected system. And I think of the digestive system as being very foundational. Like everything in your body got there through your digestive system, basically. All the bones, all the muscles, everything like that was made using stuff from the digestive system. You start out with maybe 5 or 10 pounds of material when you're born that's not through your digestive system directly. It's still through somebody else's, but everything else that comes into your body is through your digestive system. So it's really important. If it's not working right, nothing else is going to work right. Nothing else is going to work as well, because that's where all the resources in your body come from. So making sure that you have, and the person that you're helping has a very healthy functioning digestive system is one of the most vital underpinnings to health, especially long term, because it is something where it can take a while for problems in the digestive system to show up in the rest of the body. It can take sometimes days, sometimes weeks, maybe sometimes even a little longer, because your body has some things in reserve and so forth. So for instance, if you stop being able to absorb fat, your body can use stored fat for a while, but eventually it's going to run out of that, and it's not going to have the ability to create things that it makes out of fat normally, which would include neurotransmitters and hormones. So that's eventually going to cause really big problems. So it can take a while for that to show up. If it's just a matter of not being able to eat, not being able to take in calories, that starts to make a difference much more quickly, because we need more of those all the time. So if you're just sort of working at home with people in your family with, or with sort of not very severe issues, maybe mild and or self-limiting issues in people's health, which is, where you probably start out in the early stages of doing herbal work for people. The digestive system is something that comes up a lot. If you think about what common complaints are, if somebody doesn't feel well, what doesn't feel well, a lot of the time it's the digestive system. A lot of the time someone might feel nauseous, or they might feel constipated. Those are probably, or they might have diarrhea. Those are 3 very common things that you see in a lot of different illnesses that are a lot of the reason someone would want to use a home remedy or want to take an over-the-counter drug or something like that. And these are often, not always, but often from external causes that would go away even if you didn't do anything. You get a stomach virus, maybe you have nausea and diarrhea for a few days. If you don't treat it in an otherwise healthy person, it's going to go on for a few days and they're going to be really miserable days. But most of the time, you wouldn't expect that to be a life-threatening situation. It can become one if it's severe enough, and it can become one much more easily in someone who's much smaller. But for the most part, we've all been through that sort of thing and not had it be a life-threatening situation usually. So that's a common thing that you're likely to see if you're taking care of children, if you're taking care of elders, if you're taking care of friends, things like that. And if you do treat it, it can be much less severe and it can be much shorter lived And so a lot of the time with that sort of thing, that's what we're going for. We're trying to make things less severe and less unpleasant. That doesn't always mean we're trying to suppress the symptoms completely, because a lot of the time the symptoms are there to do useful work. In the case of a stomach virus, the nausea and the diarrhea are there to try and get the virus out of your system. And that's true of, food poisoning or lots of other situations that would result in those types of symptoms, especially symptoms that involve expelling things, whether it's, in this case, vomiting and diarrhea, or whether it's coughing, runny nose, watering eyes. All of those are your body's way of trying to expel stuff. And all of those symptoms are trying to do the work of removing something from your body that is or is perceived as being a potential danger. So that's not always something that you just want to put an end to the symptom. Sometimes you want to support what the body's doing and make the symptom more bearable or less disruptive. And so that's, or you might want to suppress the symptom, but do something else to try and achieve the same work that the symptom was trying to do, for instance. So that's something that to consider. But a lot of the time, you do want to ease the symptoms at least. You want to make people feel better. And there are a lot of good herbs that we can use for that. So you could take herbs that are for nausea, and a lot of the time those will just quell the feeling of nausea. And then along with those, you might want to take something that would be helping the immune system to fight the virus, or to keep the virus from going elsewhere in the body. So, immune support herbs along with anti-nausea herbs, instead of just suppressing the nausea, would be my general approach to that sort of thing. With diarrhea in particular, I don't usually give people strongly diarrhea suppressing things unless they're losing a problematic amount of fluid. I think sometimes it's better to just take water and electrolytes and let it run its course. If it's causing a lot of cramping, there are things that you can do, like warming herbs, that will help the cramping in the guts to not feel as severe. And there are also things you can do to decrease the amount of diarrhea if you really need to. So that would include astringents like the oak, which we talked about before, which actually you have to be careful with to not induce nausea. But we'll talk about some other ones soon that can sort of dry up the inside of the digestive system, or ones that can absorb moisture from the inside of the digestive system. And those will be more able to ease the symptoms without undoing the process, or without working at cross purposes to what your body is trying to do, if you take them in the right doses. If you don't take a very strong constipating dose of something, but you just take enough of it to slow things down so that the person is not having as much disruption to their daily life as a result of their bowels trying to move a lot harder and faster than they want them to. And so a lot of the time, things like soluble fiber foods that are high in fiber will actually absorb a lot of, or high in soluble fiber, which would especially be grains, carbs. They'll often absorb water and help to form more solid stools that aren't completely watery in that sort of situation, without really decreasing the amount of water that's going into the intestines, without changing what's going on with peristalsis. But they might dry things up and slow things down a little bit. And so that's a really good approach to take if it's available, if the person has an appetite to be able to eat carbs and things like that. One thing that is worth noting about the digestive system is that it is a surface of the body. It is actually something that is coming in contact to some extent with the outside environment. It is outside of your bloodstream. It's in contact with the outside world, like your skin is. It's closed off from the environment to some extent, but it is like a surface of your body that is interacting with substances that aren't your body. Unlike, say, any part of your heart, which never comes in contact with anything that isn't your body. Well, in the normal course of events, of course, there are exceptions, but most of them kill you. Your digestive system is continuously in contact with food and drink and things like that that are not part of your body. So it is really considered an external surface of your body, in that it comes in contact with the outside world and with an environment that your body didn't create. So everything, once it gets through your digestive system, is in a created environment, in something that is completely, enfolded within your body. But your skin and your digestive tract are in contact with things that are not your body. So that's something to be aware of, and it's something that, because that's the case, it is subject to a lot of the same types of threats and insults as your skin is, which is like it can come in contact with bacteria a lot more easily. For instance, you don't really have a lot of bacteria floating around in your bloodstream unless you're really, really in bad shape. Some might get introduced through breaks in your skin and stuff like that, but a minuscule amount in most cases. And even if you get an infected wound, most of the infection is in the wound channel, not spread throughout your body, until the point where you become septic, and then you're in real bad trouble then. But in the digestive system, is always in contact with outside microbes, microbes that form, in some cases they cause problems, in some cases they're actually doing a lot of the work of breaking down substances and creating some nutrients. So there's like a process of fermentation that's going on. You could think of it as fermentation. It's technically maybe a little bit different, but where in your digestive system, in your intestines, there are bacteria that are breaking down food and creating other substances. And some of those other substances that they're creating are being absorbed into your bloodstream. Vitamin B12 is one example. Sometimes vitamin B12 is actually created by the intestinal flora that people have. You can also get it from eating other animals whose digestive flora created it. And so for a lot of humans, our digestive flora isn't making much of it, but it is making some, and it is an essential nutrient. So there are a lot of things like that that are partially or completely made by our microbes. The microbes can also cause, bacteria can also cause some problems, like strep throat, for instance. That's a bacterial infection in the beginning part of the digestive system. Sometimes you'll have things like lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is a category of bacteria. They cause tooth decay. They're involved in gingivitis, but they're also important to have in your guts. So if you have too many of them in your mouth, they're going to cause destructive situations. But if you have a good amount of them further down in your digestive system, they're actually helping to create the right environment, create the right pH, create some of the substances that your body uses. And so that's something that, depending on where it is and how much of it is, you could think of it as a commensal organism, as something that's a beneficial bacteria, or you could think of it as something that's causing a problem. It can do both. So it's not entirely to be thought of as good or evil necessarily. It's just about balance and about being in the right place and in the right amounts, which is often the case with when you're looking at things from a more holistic perspective, is that it's not necessarily a matter of a bacteria being a pathogen and causing a disease versus being a good bacteria and causing helpful things. It's a matter of how much of it is there is. And strep is the same way. A lot of people have strep and it's really just kind of along for the ride. It's not really, might not be doing anything all that beneficial, but it's not causing any harm. But depending on where it is and how much of it there is, it might also be causing problems. Just a second, I've got a few. One question was, is heartburn under the nausea category? It's a similar process. A lot of the time you feel heartburn when acid is coming back up and you feel nausea. Nausea is a different sensation, but it also can involve peristalsis, moving the wrong direction, or the tendency towards movement in your digestive system being towards the wrong direction. It's a question of whether there would be a link for last week's class. There should be a link already for last week's class. If you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, it'll be on there. I'll resend the link for that to make sure, in case I somehow didn't send it or something. Oh, and then hang on. Okay, so as far as getting rid of bacteria from the mouth or keeping it from being too there being too much of it, rather than without destroying what's in the gut. So you don't really want to use things that are actually there to kill bacteria, especially since it's in your mouth where you can reach them. Washing your mouth out, brushing your teeth, things like that can get rid of them without affecting the stuff further down, or can not necessarily get rid of them, but get rid of some of them, decrease the level of them. In the case of lactobacillus, it forms a biofilm, which we think of it called plaque on the teeth. It's part of that. So disrupting that plaque with just the mechanical activity of brushing, it's not even so much what's in the toothpaste, it's just the fact that you're using the bristles to break up the biofilm and then spitting it out. That has a lot to do with it. And the other thing is the level of acidity in your mouth. And the level of acidity in your mouth increases when you're hungry. It often increases right after you've eaten as well, because it's because the food can increase it, and then it decreases if you have when you're drinking water. That tends to decrease it. So that's so drinking enough water is important. Disrupting the biofilm physically through brushing, and of course flossing to make sure you don't have retained bits of food in your mouth. All of that is going to help with keeping the bacterial load in your mouth to an appropriate level. If you drink sugary drinks, then that sugariness is going to stay on your teeth. It's going to stick to your teeth, and it's going to give. Usually sugary drinks are acidic. Not because of the sugar. If you drank plain sugar water, that's not really acidic, but coffee is, tea is, soda is, juice is. So most of the things that we drink as sugary drinks have some acidity to them, pretty considerable acidity to them, and that's going to increase the load of some of these bacteria. And not drinking things like that, or drinking water right after them so that it's not stuck to your teeth, is a useful thing as well. And then what the loads are like in your digestive system or in your guts has a lot to do with not being constipated, which tends towards overgrowth, not having diarrhea, which tends towards not having enough of them, making sure that you have substrates that they can grow on. Substrates are just the stuff that they grow on, but in particular, there is a whole category of carbohydrates called fructooligosaccharides, which are things that our bodies aren't really great at digesting. But then bacteria in our gut do digest them. A lot of the time, these things cause gas, So foods that cause gas like cabbage and beans tend to contain a lot of them, because that's what's going on, is you're getting a lot of bacterial growth on them. But fermented vegetables and root vegetables tend to have good sources of the kind of substrates that gut bacteria like to grow on. And in my experience as a clinician, that's actually more important than probiotics. Like, I recommend probiotics to people all the time who have taken antibiotics or who have had a lot of diarrhea or something like that, where their gut flora is likely to have been impacted. I don't actually usually look at a stool sample under the microscope to see how it's been impacted unless it's an ongoing thing. But if it's a situation where it's like that, where it's likely to have been impacted, I'll usually recommend probiotics, but I think it's really important that it's even more important that people create the right terrain for it rather than just trying to load the bacteria in it. And the right terrain in this case means having these types of carbs that you would get from root vegetables and from fermented vegetables, especially cooked root vegetables. They contain the same substances, but structurally they're mushier and they get broken up more easily in the digestive system. So they're more available to, the nutrients in them are more available to your body and to your gut flora. So those are all really important things for somebody who's been through either a sickness or a round of antibiotics that is likely to have impacted their gut bacteria. Just a second. Oh, thank you. Canker sores are a little bit of a different thing. I'll talk about them more when I'm talking about the immune system. But yes, so these are all things that are more just directly in the digestive system. And so these are some of the things that you're likely to run into in the course of working with people who have digestive systems. Sometimes I think about earthworms. Earthworms basically just have a few organs. They have a circulatory system, which is really simple. They have a digestive system, which is basically a straight tube. And they have a nerve, and then they have their surface, their skin, and some musculature that moves them around. And that's really all they have. They're very simple. Humans are like a very much more complicated variation on that. But those are still the most foundational things, is the digestive system, the circulatory system, and the nervous system. So, your circulation, your nerves, and your ability to take in nutrients and transform them. And that's what the digestive system is all about. It's about transformation. It's about taking things that you find in your environment and making them into part of yourself. Another thing that you run into with digestion, with the digestive system, another kind of category of things that you run into with the digestive system, is dryness or lack of, some people would describe it as digestive fire. That's sort of a metaphorical way of putting it. Lack of transformative ability of the digestive system, where maybe somebody is just not producing a lot of digestive juices. And that tends to look like dry mouth, lack of appetite, and constipation are kind of the manifestations of that you could see on the outside. This is very common in older people. It's very common in people who've had a long sickness. So, if you happen to be your family's go-to person for taking care of people, it's something that you'll likely get familiar with, because it's a very common thing in people who are just very depleted, which most of us become at some point in our life, especially towards the end of our lives, but sometimes just during a long sickness without it being the end of our lives. So getting the digestive system to produce more juices and have more movement because it's not so dried out is one of the secrets to longevity. it is one of the keys to having a happy, healthy life, is being able to produce enough digestive juices to keep your digestive system nourishing your body. And that, you probably notice that as people age, they tend to like sort of shrivel and shrink. And that's because they're not as able to bring in resources from the outside world. They lose that ability. And that's kind of what makes you old. That's kind of what makes you frail, is that you lose the ability to transform things in your body. It's hard for your body to heal when it can't bring the resources from the food that you're eating and turn them into new human tissue. It's why people's bones get weak. It's because they're not as able, part of the reason is because they're not as able to absorb the calcium from their food. They're not as able to turn that calcium into bone, which requires also that they be able to absorb protein. And it also requires that they have energy, which is all very tied together and all very contingent on having enough digestive juices. And so there are a lot of things that are drying to people. Alcohol is something that a lot of people use that is very drying. Alcoholic beverages, opiates are extremely drying to the digestive system, and that can take a really big toll on somebody's body's ability to keep nurturing itself. So those things are to be avoided if possible. And then in addition to that, there are a lot of substances that help to produce or to bring more juices into the digestive system. And those substances are different for different stages of the digestive system. So last time we talked about bitter herbs stimulating the liver to produce liver substances, to produce bile. So that's one part of the process. Saliva is actually produced a lot more in connection with sour things. So if you taste something like if you put a few drops of lemon juice in your mouth, or if you try spitting into a cup and then put a few drops of lemon juice in your mouth and then try spitting into a cup again and see how much more spit you produce. There are other things, we call them sialagogues. It's a whole category of herbs that stimulate the production of saliva. Echinacea is one. Phalaris is another one. There are a lot of them. But sour things, sour foods, including sauerkraut, which is a fermented food and contains lactic acid, including lemon juice, which is a fruit that contains citric acid, and apples contain malic acid. These are all different acids, organic acids, that have a stimulating effect on the digestive system, because they're all things that your body would encounter in food and would tend to produce more fluid in response to. Spicy foods also increase circulation to the digestive system because they're having this warming effect, which really only lasts until, that's not always true. It's more noticeable in the throat and the stomach, that you'll have more capillary perfusion, more circulation to and warm feeling in your digestive system, down to the point of your stomach especially. The intestines don't have as much ability to feel that. It doesn't mean it's not still happening, but it's not as noticeable and it's not as pronounced an effect. But spicy foods help with that part of the process. And bitters help with the colon and the intestines, as well as the liver, because they're kind of downstream from the liver. So all of those things are going to be helping to produce more juices at different points in the process. So having a varied diet that contains different substances, we don't necessarily think of a lot of let's see, a lot of the foods that have become standard in American diet are kind of bland. Like, for example, if you grow your own lettuce, a lot of the time it's actually quite bitter. And some types of lettuce, like endive, are bitter if you buy them from the grocery store. Your standard iceberg lettuce isn't at all. It tastes like water. Romaine lettuce can be bitter, but usually the stuff that you buy in the store isn't, because it's not really what people are looking for. It's not considered a desirable trait. So it's kind of been bred out of a lot of commercial varieties of lettuce, and they're produced in ways where they're not exposed to a lot of sun so that they don't become bitter, things like that. But lettuce would be an example of a bitter food in the normal course of things, especially, like I said, if you're growing your own. Whereas root vegetables are usually somewhat sweet. Sweet potatoes obviously are. Carrots are a little bit, turnips are somewhat sweet. They're not sweet compared to sugary stuff, but they are, if you were to categorize them as sweet, sour, salty, or bitter, they do tend to be on the sweet side of things. So getting a variety of foods that contain a variety of flavors, especially a variety of fairly strong flavors, can actually be a really good thing for your digestive system. That's the situation that it's sort of designed for, or that it is evolved to support. Because from the beginning of the world up until about, I don't know, 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, most people were just growing and gathering and foraging a lot of their food. And you ate whatever was available that time of year, and some of it was pretty strong tasting. You'd have, like I said, bitter lettuce from your own garden, and you'd have sour fruit from your own trees. And now, people have tried to commercialize the least bitter lettuce and the least sour apples and things like that. So depending on what varieties you're getting, it might all be pretty bland, but that's not really what we're set up for, and that's not really what's the healthiest for us. It's really healthy for you to have all these different flavors and to be activating all the different transformative capabilities of your digestive system. So diet obviously is a huge part of taking care of the digestive system. Fiber, which I mentioned a little bit before, is a really important part of the process. I think the standard industrial diet does not get a lot of roughage. Roughage is just stuff that you don't really digest completely. Things like leaves, that it's not like it's going to be completely broken down and absorbed. It's just going to pass through you. You're going to get some things out of it. And it's also going to provide a substrate for certain bacteria to grow on. And it's going to change the consistency of things as it's moving through your body. So that could include things like leaves, seaweed, something we don't get a lot of around here, but it contains a lot of polysaccharides, a lot of special starches that are going to make things smoother in your digestive system and be soothing to your digestive system, and maybe also increase the circulation to it as well. So as much of a varied diet as you can manage to feed yourself is really important. The things that are cheaply grown for calories, for in industrialized agriculture, you get things like wheat and potatoes, or white flour and potatoes, and that'll keep you alive. That'll give you enough calories and energy to go to work for now, but it's not necessarily the most conducive to health in old age, or feeling your best, or having your best odds of not developing a chronic illness, which is kind of not really what the industrial food system is set up for. So that's something that's important to be critical of and to be cautious about, and try and find foods that are really what your digestive system is made for and that are nurturing in lots of different ways, instead of just focusing on, getting enough calories and energy to be useful, and not just getting enough vitamins not to develop deficiencies, but getting enough variety of different substances. Because at some point in the 20th century or so, somebody picked out a few different nutrients and said these are the vitamins, and the rest of them, the rest of the things that we've been consuming don't necessarily get called that, but it doesn't mean our body doesn't miss them when they're not there. So it's kind of an artificial system, the way that we're trained to think about nutrition, or the sort of way that nutrition is researched and written about and so forth, is based on a fairly contrived system that has a lot to do with making sure people are useful workers, rather than making sure that they are able to get the most out of their own lives and enjoy their lives and things like that. So another thing that happens with the digestive system, another of the things that often goes wrong, is inflammation in the digestive system. Inflammation, we talked about quite a bit before, and inflammation in the digestive system, you don't really see the redness or the swelling or anything like that. But a lot of the time there's pain. A lot of the time, depending where it is, there might be a sensation of heat. And a lot of the time there is obstruction because of change in the size of the openings through which the digested material has to pass. So people get constipation, or a lot of the time, if somebody has digestion in their guts, they'll get diarrhea first because it's irritated and it's producing more fluid and so forth. And then that will turn to constipation later because it's swollen to the point where stuff isn't passing through it so easily, and maybe it's become dry from being swollen as well. So those are the sort of things that you look for with inflammation. And ultimately, inflammation in the digestive system will lead to ulceration, which is bleeding, and that sometimes is the first thing that's noticed, depending on where it is in the digestive system. So if somebody's having bloody stools, a lot of the time that's a result of inflammation somewhere in the digestive system. So inflammation in the digestive system is not treated all that differently than inflammation other places. They're just the same types of anti-inflammatory herbs would bring it down, but it's recognized differently because it's not as visible as inflammation on the skin, and it's not necessarily as palpable or as noticeable as inflammation in the joints. The digestive system is moving parts, but they're soft moving parts rather than hard moving parts like the joints. So when a joint gets swollen, you really notice that the parts are not fitting together as well anymore. With the digestive system, it's kind of flexible and stretchy anyway, so it's not so much a matter of things fitting tightly together, but eventually you get either diarrhea or obstruction that can be a result of inflammation. So so some of the things that you might use, ginger is one that I'm going to talk about in a little bit here, but it's a really great thing for inflammation in the digestive system. I really like violets and violet syrup for the digestive system. Willow is an anti-inflammatory, but it can be hard on the digestive system, so it's usually not what I would use. Sweet birch, on the other hand, if you have access to that plant, it's wonderful for the digestive system and for inflammation in the digestive system. And wintergreen leaf is as well, if that grows where you live. It's not really a commercial herb. I don't mean oil of wintergreen, which is poisonous. It's made from the same plant, but it's not in a form that your body can use. So I mean wintergreen leaf, which is a little leathery spoon-shaped leaf that grows on the ridge tops here in Kentucky and in the eastern part of North America, and you can find it all winter long, which is why it's called wintergreen. But sometimes it's purple in the winter. We call it winter purple, but haven't been able to really get people on board with calling it that. So Gaultheria is its Latin name. But if it grows where you live, it's a lovely plant to know. If it doesn't grow where you live, it's not so much a commercially traded thing. But yeah, so inflammation is a really important one to know what to do with. And like I said, some of the other issues would be dryness or not enough juices being produced in the digestive system, leading to deficiency throughout the body. That's more of a long-term thing. Nausea and vomiting and diarrhea, which are kind of the body trying to expel things. And that tends to be a short-term thing. And then lack of appetite is also a really big one that comes up for a lot of people. Lack of appetite is usually related to the nervous system. It can also be related to the endocrine system. So if somebody is not experiencing the conditions that would typically be associated with safety, then they're going to not really necessarily have the substances in their body. Like there's one in particular called ghrelin, which is like a hormone that we know about, and there are probably others that we don't, that is involved in hunger. And your body doesn't really produce this necessarily under certain types of stress. So some people eat when they're stressed because it's comforting, but a lot of people also lose their appetite if the stress gets severe enough. And for some people, they lose their appetite right away when they get nervous. So that lack of appetite is something that comes up a lot for people for anxiety related reasons. It can also come up as if their blood sugar is tending to run high. Sometimes that will make people not have appetites. And if somebody is just kind of chronically ill or experiencing nausea on an ongoing basis, obviously, that would do it too. So inflammation in the stomach can contribute to it. So all of those things that contribute to a lack of appetite, a lack of appetite is not necessarily a problem in the short term, but if it's an ongoing thing, then it can become severe. If somebody is losing a pound a week or something like that without meaning to, then that can actually be pretty problematic. And that is something that happens a lot with people who are sick, people who are undergoing chemotherapy. It's one of the main ways that it's one of the main threats to people's survival is their ability to continue to nurture themselves, which they might not have if they don't have an appetite. And it can be very hard for people who don't have an appetite to make themselves eat. And if you haven't experienced that can sound weird. And often family members have a hard time comprehending that sort of thing. But the process of eating can actually feel pretty gross if you're not hungry. And so a lot of the time people will just kind of waste away because they can't bring themselves to eat. And so there are herbs that stimulate the diet. Bitters usually work. Cannabis is something that a lot of people are familiar with, although it, tends to throw other things out of balance, makes people feel weird and that sort of thing. Chamomile is a really easy one that it can produce some drowsiness too, but in a small amount, it usually doesn't, especially if the person is already kind of anxious. A cup of chamomile tea, 30 minutes or so before a meal can really make a difference. Sometimes I combine chamomile and dandelion leaf for that purpose. Both of them work through different means to stimulate the appetite. So having a cup of chamomile and dandelion leaf tea, or a half a teaspoon of dandelion and chamomile tincture, compound tincture, in some warm water, half an hour before a meal, can really make it more bearable for somebody to eat. You can make it so that they're more able to eat nurturing and sustaining amount of food. And you know, the lack of appetite can often go along with the dryness in the digestive system. So, you know, warming things can be helpful too. Warming spices and that sort of thing can be really helpful as well. So, would inflammation be part of why the ileocecal valve can stick closed between the small and large intestine? Yeah, inflammation is often part of it. The other part of it is if the nerves are if the muscles around it are going into spasm, which can happen because of inflammation. It can also happen because of imbalance in electrolytes. Haven't really gotten into that part because it's a little bit maybe too complicated, but just to give a vague overview of things, the process of peristalsis, the muscular movement that pushes things along the digestive system, is really contingent upon electrolytes being what they're supposed to be, especially calcium, but other electrolytes as well. They're what conduct the electricity that helps those muscles to contract. And if they are not in the correct balance, then sometimes that doesn't happen the way that it's supposed to. And so that is actually the responsibility of the kidneys to keep those in check. So we don't usually, you know, or a lot of the time people don't think of the kidneys as having a big effect on the digestive system. But if the kidneys are really thrown off, it's going to really throw off the digestive system a lot of the time, because it's partly because they're doing parallel work, and the digestive system will try and make up for getting rid of waste products that the kidney can't in some cases. But the electrolytes are really almost entirely handled by the kidneys. And if they're not working, then the peristalsis is not going to work the way that it's supposed to. And neither is the heartbeat or any of the other autonomic muscular things that go on in the body. It's all kind of, I wouldn't say run by the kidneys, it's run by the brainstem, but the kidneys provide a crucial component of the machinery that allows that to happen. So there's a question about loose stools and cramping at night. The tea of marshmallow root might help, and something warming might help as well. I like cinnamon in that kind of situation. Cinnamon is warming and it's slippery the way that marshmallow is. I don't know if you know this about cinnamon, but if you make a decoction of cinnamon, it's very much slimy. Let's see if I can find some. I should have some around here. So this is cinnamon. This is like the kind of the bottom of the barrel or the bottom of the jar of some cinnamon extract. But if I can get the stuff to start pouring off here. Well, there's not much left of it, but it's actually, I don't know if this will actually show up on the camera, but it's not really watery. It's very slimy. It's very thick substance, kind of like what marshmallow root would be. So it is a demulcent, but it's also warming. And so I really like that for cramping and loose stools, because it has that same absorptive effect that marshmallow has. And then it's also pretty strongly warming. So it's good for any kind of pain that heat would make better. And cramping type pain is usually made better by heat. And that's actually something that can be really good for the digestive system that's topical or external, is putting, holding onto a hot water bottle against the lower digestive system. That can actually soothe things quite a bit. The cinnamon is going to do that kind of more from the insides, but it takes a while for it to get where it needs to go. So it's something that you would want to try and take as far in advance as you could, even up to hours in advance, because it's going to take a while for it to work its way down into the lower parts of the digestive system, whereas a hot water bottle is just kind of right there. Castor oil topically is also traditional for cramping guts. People call it griping in old books, which when they say griping, they don't mean complaining. They mean cramping in the intestines. So, I really like cinnamon for that, and I usually use cinnamon along with any kind of stimulant laxative. Stimulant laxatives are laxatives that work by stimulating the peristalsis in the intestines. And for most of them, they'll contain a substance that doesn't stimulate peristalsis, but then it gets broken down by the bacteria in the large intestine and becomes a substance that does stimulate peristalsis. So they don't really have this effect all along your digestive system, but they do once they get in your guts. Senna is a well-known example of that. Senna is the kind of the active ingredient in X-Lax and in a lot of herbal laxatives. Buckthorn, which we saw on our walk, is a more intense version of that. There's a commercial variety of buckthorn called Cascara sagrada, which is it's the bark of one species of buckthorn, but they all do the same kind of thing. They get into the intestine and they turn into something that stimulates peristalsis and stimulates a strong contraction of the guts to push out any constipation. So if I'm ever using something like that, which I don't use very often, I'll use cinnamon along with it because it helps to soften the stools, which makes the cramping less, and it also helps to warm the insides so that the cramping isn't as severe, even if the muscle contraction is strong. So yeah, I like it for any kind of cramping in the guts, and especially if it's along with irregularity in either direction. But the laxatives, those kind of stimulant laxatives, they're really common in herbal products. I don't use them in my practice except in situations where somebody has been on medicine that makes their peristalsis not happen. Like, for example, if somebody's been on painkillers for a while, or if they've undergone surgery and then they're not having bowel movements afterwards, it can be really helpful for that. But I like to add it. I like to combine it with the cinnamon because then it's less intense. There's a species of aloe that's the usual stimulant laxative that I use, and contains some pretty strong laxative substances, but it's short acting. It doesn't keep going for a long period of time. It doesn't keep working for a long period of time. You get about 30 minutes of movement from it, and then it gives you a break. Then you can repeat the dose as necessary. So it's not as harrowing an experience for someone as maybe the buckthorn would be. All right. So the first herb that I wanted to talk about is ginger. Ginger is a really good herb for the digestive system. It's anti-inflammatory, and it's one of my favorite anti-inflammatories for the whole body. And it's also very good against nausea. So those are the two main things that I use ginger for. nausea, and inflammation. And it's, I'd say we're all pretty familiar with ginger. It's not, it's been a familiar kitchen spice in the English speaking world for about 700 years or so, quite a while. And has been used as an herbal remedy that entire time. And then, of course, in places where it actually grows, it's actually got one of the longest written track records of any medicinal substance. So it's been around for thousands of years. Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine have used it since nearly the dawn of human writing. I mean, possibly before then, but they've been writing about it since nearly the dawn of human writing. So it's something that we really know what to expect from, and at the same time, it's pretty powerful. It's pretty powerful, even though it doesn't tend to cause overdoses, or it's not something you have to be real careful with. It's just, but it is very powerful, and when you taste it, it tastes strong, it tastes powerful. You can tell that it's really doing something, but that something doesn't ever add up to something dangerous. I mean, I suppose you could choke on it, or maybe if you made a dedicated effort, you could take enough of it to cause some kind of harm. But it's not something you really have to worry about. I've routinely had people take an inch-long chunk of ginger at a time, a few times a day, and it's a lot of herbal material, but not something that you really have to worry about. So you can make it into a tea. It's a really straightforward way to take it. You can also mix the powder with honey, which is a very traditional way of taking it. The other thing that you probably noticed if you've eaten Thai food or other spicy foods that has ginger in it is that it does make your nose run. It makes your sinuses drain. And so that can be useful too. If somebody's been exposed to a lot of allergens and they're having hay fever or just a lot of congestion, ginger can really help to get things going with that, help to get things to clear out. And there are some people who recommend snorting a small amount of powdered ginger. I don't think that's a good idea. I think that's one of those dramatic but not necessarily wise things that often come up in traditional healing that I don't really love. Ginger with other spicy stuff, I mean, really good for respiratory things. I would call ginger a mild expectorant. Yes, definitely. It breaks up chest congestion some. It's a decongestant more than it is an expectorant is a decongestant, which includes its expectorant abilities, but also the fact that it just kind of makes, if you have a thick congestion in your sinuses, it'll make it thin out and help it get it out of there. So that's a really good thing for ginger. It will induce sweating. If you take hot ginger tea, it will make your body sweat, which can then cool you off from a fever. Even though the ginger itself is warming, it can induce sweating, and the sweating is cooling. So it can be used to help break a fever, basically, which sometimes if somebody has a fever and they take ginger, sometimes they'll start sweating really profusely, like soak their bed sheets kind of sweating, and then the fever will stop. And that can be, a dramatic turnaround. But it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes it just mildly induces some sweating and reduces the fever by a degree or two. And that can be really helpful too. And, it's good for nausea. There have been some studies comparing it to Dramamine, which is like a more of a conventional nausea drug. I saw at least one small study that compared it to cannabis, and it worked considerably similar to either or both of them. all that's going to depend on doses that you use and things like that. You know, it's not obviously comparing the same doses of any of the three. So kind of a weird way to look at things, but an effective dose of ginger can be as much as you want it to be. If you want to drink a quart of ginger tea, you can do that. Ginger ale is another traditional way of taking it, which is made by grating the ginger and steeping that in water, which often has a little bit of lemon juice in it, may have some sugar added to it. Doesn't necessarily have to have any sugar added to it, but when I'm making it, I add a little bit of maple syrup just for sweetness. But the yeast is then added to it, and it's allowed to ferment overnight. And this is and then strained into bottles and sealed and refrigerated. So this is it does have yeast in it, but it's not fermented long enough and it's fermented in an open container, like a bowl with a screen over it, so that bugs don't get in it, rather than being fermented in a closed vapor lock thing where it would be making alcohol. So it makes a little bit of lactic acid, maybe a tiny amount of alcohol, but not a clinically significant amount. And it makes a sweet, fizzy, gingery drink with lots of probiotics in it. What kind of yeast do I use? Usually what I use is the yeast at the bottom of whatever I brewed last. So like I'll have elderberry wine brewing, and then I'll pour off a little bit of the yeast from the bottom of that and put it in the next thing I'm brewing, which might be the ginger ale. If you don't want to do it that way, or you don't have that going in your kitchen, you can get Red Star champagne yeast from a homebrew shop. And if you don't want to do that, you can just get baker's yeast and it will still work. If you use baker's yeast, it might taste more yeasty. It might have more of that like yeast flavor to it. But you know, you would be letting some of that settle out before you bottled it anyway, straining some of it out, but it will give some of that flavor. If you have a recipe, I will try to remember to get a recipe written down and post that. I've been having a hard time keeping up with that because just about every time I have some kind of recipe that I want to write down and put in the comments to the video, and I haven't been doing that nearly as often as I've meant to. Let me make a note for myself. Okay. Yeah, I'll try to put that up there, but it's a pretty simple process, and makes a pretty, you know, fun and acceptable product. It's a good thing to have around. It's rehydrating. It's going to quell nausea, increase appetite, and put back some of the gut bacteria. So all of that is pretty positive type of thing. But yeah, ginger is really good for that. And like I said, it's really good for inflammation. It's good for inflammation in the digestive system too. If somebody has an inflammatory bowel type of condition, sometimes ginger can feel too spicy to them, but a lot of the time it doesn't. If it does, you can use turmeric instead, but a lot of the time it doesn't. And a lot of the time it will really be helpful to the digestive system, to inflammation in the digestive system. And it's really helpful for inflammation elsewhere, and whether it's headaches, arthritis, joint pain, all that sort of thing. It contains some substances that they block some of the enzymes that are involved in the sort of chemical reaction that leads to pain and inflammation. So they're actually sort of the process of inflammation in the body is a chemical chain reaction that has several steps to it, and they interfere with one of those steps by keeping an enzyme from breaking down another substance and making so that the chemical reaction doesn't happen. So it's a good way to reduce pain, and it's not sedating and it's not stimulating. So it's a really useful thing, and it's one of these herbs that I feel like everybody should know, just for the fact that it has a wide variety of uses. It's powerful, and you can't go wrong with it very easily. There's not a lot of harm you can do with ginger, as compared to even, you can kill yourself with Tylenol, for instance, which does a lot of the same things. You can't really kill yourself with ginger, but taking it long term isn't going to cause liver damage the way that the Tylenol would, or stomach damage the way that ibuprofen or aspirin are likely to. So it's a lot safer. It's a lot healthier for you. It's actually increasing the functionality of your digestive system and your digestive system's ability to nurture itself and your body's ability to heal itself. And it's also increasing circulation, which is generally good. It's helping the nutrients from your digestive system to get to all the different parts of your body, and the oxygen from your lungs to get to all the different parts of your body. So it's useful for a lot of different things. Hang on just a second. Can it be taken in tincture? Yeah, ginger can be taken in tincture. I use ginger in tincture all the time. This is one of my ginger tinctures. I also have a fermented ginger tincture. This sort of it's basically fermented ginger, but lactic acid fermentation, so more like fermented with sauerkraut type bacteria, as opposed to fermented with yeast, as in the ginger ale. But I use both of them a lot in my practice. The lactic acid one is less spicy. I also use turmeric, which is like a very similar plant with very similar properties. They're all really lovely things. You can grow them yourself. If you want to grow ginger, all you have to do is get sand and get a ginger root from the produce section of your grocery store, and put it in sand and water it and give it lots of sunlight, and it will grow. It'll grow roots, and the rhizome. Part of ginger that we use is the rhizome, so it's actually like an underground section of stem, and the scales on it are kind of like a modified leaf, but it will grow a stalk from one end of it that will have grass-like leaves on it. And I've managed to get it to flower a couple times. We don't live in a tropical environment here, but if you have a greenhouse, you can get it to flower pretty easily. If you have it on a windowsill, something like that, it may or may not flower, but it'll grow for quite a while and it'll get bigger. Oh, you saw turmeric flowering today at Timmy's house. That's great. Was it growing outside? Yeah, it's in the summer it can grow outside, but I've often grown it in either this tank here, this terrarium type thing, or these types of things. I have these little apothecary jars that, is that showing up? No. Yeah, I have these apothecary jars with layers of sand. I sometimes grow plants in more for a demonstration, decoration type of thing than anything else. I do use them medicinally, but obviously I'm not growing any kind of large quantities in just an apothecary jar. But anyway, yeah, it's a pleasant plant to have around, and depending where you live, you might be able to grow it outdoors, or you might be able to grow it in a container inside. It actually takes them outside in the warm months. That's good, wouldn't it? when I used to live on a farm, we had some in a greenhouse, and we would have it outside the greenhouse in the summertime, because the greenhouse was like 50% shade. It was mostly for growing orchids, but it stayed warm enough in the winter that it was better than being outside for them. So yeah, ginger is one of the really good herbs that has a wide variety of medicinal uses, and powerful substances, and very little potential for harm. What we might call a very wide therapeutic margin, meaning that a very wide range between how much you have to take of it to get a medicinal effect versus how much of it you would have to take before it started causing problems. And with ginger, it's a huge amount. I don't even know what you would have to do with it for it to start causing problems. But yeah, circulation and inflammation are really probably the most common reasons that I use ginger in my clinical practice, although I don't have a lot of people coming to my clinical practice with nausea that is just from something transitory, like a stomach virus. They would most likely treat that at home. So it's not something I see here as much. But in the course of raising children and things like that, I did use it for that a lot. So as a home remedy, that's probably the thing that I've used it the most for. In clinical practice, I've used it more for inflammation and circulation. In either case, really great herb to know. And I would encourage everybody to buy some, taste it, try preparing it in different ways, and just really develop a relationship with this plant, develop a relationship with ginger, and know where the good ginger is in your community. And I've within walking distance of the clinic right here, there are 4 places I think that sell ginger, fresh ginger, and one of them has much better quality than the others. So it's just kind of depends on what's around you. But it's you get a lot of variation in quality with ginger, because a lot of it's not grown locally. A lot of it is grown in tropical areas and then flown here. Some of it has sat around for a lot longer. Some of it is probably grown under better or worse conditions. Really good ginger should be firm, not real wrinkly. Should be the skin of it should be slightly translucent, rather than looking like paper bag type material. And if you slice it open, it's good if it has like a yellowish color rather than just white. So those are all things that I look for with when I'm trying to find good quality ginger. Hang on just a minute. Okay. Yeah, so the other herb that I wanted to talk about this week is slippery elm. And slippery elm is the inner bark of a particular type of elm tree. This is a slightly environmentally, or not even slightly, this is a somewhat environmentally sensitive herb to gather, because elm trees, at least here in North America, have had their population decreased quite a bit by Dutch elm disease, which is a fungal infection. And because of habitat loss, there aren't so many slippery elm trees as there might have once been. And also because it's a tree that can be very old and very large, and if you prune it incorrectly or harvest from it incorrectly, you can kill the tree. So that's something to be aware of if you are going to try and source your own slippery elm. It is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. Slippery elm is, let's see, but it is something that a lot of people, a lot of people in this part of the country, in Eastern North America, do gather and use as a home remedy. And it does have a variety of uses, and it is also, an herb that can produce some pretty pronounced results without having much potential for damage or toxicity or anything like that. So when people gather it, they either take a branch off of the tree, or else they take a section, or else they take a small tree. I've seen places where people have killed the tree by peeling off a large section of the trunk, and that's like a terrible waste. Anytime you cut a tree, it does make it vulnerable to fungal infection also. So that's something to be aware of. But most of the commercially available slippery elm is gathered in Kentucky, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. And a lot of it is gathered by families who have been doing it for generations, and who know what they're doing, basically. So there is good, ethically sourced, commercially available slippery elm out there, and it is possible to gather it yourself in a sustainable way. It's just that you do have to be careful. Usually, when I'm gathering it, I find a small tree, and I cut down the tree and take the bark from that whole tree. And use that for a few years. And when I say a small tree, I mean something that's maybe as big around as my wrist, not a big tree at all. So it's not something I use a ton of, but it is a useful thing to have around. Slippery elm is a demulcent, so it produces, when you make a tea of it, the tea is kind of like thick, a little bit slimy, and contains, just like what I was saying before with other things with that type of consistency, contains some special starches that absorb water and kind of bind the water inside the matrix of starch molecules to form the slippery substance. Slippery elm can also be peeled as strips, and those can be soaked in water, and the strip itself is slippery. That used to be something that they sold in pharmacies and things like that. People actually use them for dilation and curettage. People use them to like perform abortions at home and things like that. And they stopped selling it in that form because that became illegal for a while. And kind of not necessarily advisable in any case. But the shredded bark is the usual form that you would find it in if you buy it. Whereas the strip is usually more like what you end up with if you harvest it yourself. And the strips can just be cut up into small pieces and soaked to make tea. Or you can put the whole strip in water. It's like stiff until it gets wet, and then it turns flexible. But the shredded stuff makes the tea faster. It turns into a tea-like consistency more quickly. So one of the main things this would be used for is sore throat, sort of coats and soothes. So sore throat, stomach pain, sometimes ulcers, has mild antibacterial effects. So it can also be used as a wash for wounds. It does have a history of being used as food for people who are not able to take other sorts of food. And it's, maybe more of a liquid than a food, strictly speaking. But you can, depending on how you prepare it, it can be more like a mushy type of substance with the bark still in it, or it can be like a thick liquid. You can soak it overnight, and it will actually get very thick if you soak it overnight and then strain it. So that's something that has been used for people who are not able to take other foods, not able to take more solid foods. It apparently does contain enough calories and things like that, calories and minerals and so forth, to keep somebody going for a while, and keep them maybe from being dehydrated and stuff too. It might help get their appetite back, since it is soothing to the digestive system. So that can be something that could be useful to know about. But yeah, for sore throats is one of the main things that I recommend it for. Another way that it can be prepared for that is to powder the bark, to grind the bark up to a powder, and then mix that with just enough honey or maple syrup to make a sort of dough-like substance, and roll that into tiny balls, and then let those dry out. And it makes a little sort of pastille that somebody can suck on, that's soothing to the throat. And so that's something that's a traditional remedy around here. It's also more like a medicinal candy, an electuary. I'll try to add the recipe for that too. Another traditional kind of traditional modern traditional, I don't know how to say it, a remedy that's been around for several years is a combination of powdered slippery elm, 4 parts powdered slippery elm with 1 part each of powdered golden seal and powdered myrrh. And this is called people paste. So you take the powder and you mix it with enough water to turn it into a paste-like substance, and you can use that on wounds. And it's sort of a soothing, anti-infective wound glue that I can't remember who introduced that to us. It was a recipe in an herb book that was popular in the 80s. I can't remember which one though. That's unfortunate. But Lalitha Thomas, is that who it was? Yeah, maybe so. I do not recall. Okay, Rachel says it was Lalitha Thomas. But so anyway, that's been around for some decades now. It's not like an ancient remedy or anything, and it involves herbs from different parts of the world, because the golden seal and the slippery elm are from the woods here, and then the myrrh is from Africa and South Asia. So not necessarily herbs that would have come in contact with each other before a few hundred years ago, but that particular name for it and that particular combination of herbs has been around for a few decades now, and has been a popular remedy with people who use herbs. And it's a useful one. It's a good herbal first aid thing to have around. I've used it a lot of times. I started using it when I was working at rainbow gatherings, doing first aid for these hippie gatherings that happen in national forests. And you see all kinds of injuries because people are walking around barefoot, often barefoot and under the influence of various substances, and in natural environments that they're maybe not all that used to. So you get a lot of foot injuries, or people cutting themselves while cutting wood and things like that. Just people operating outside of their comfort zone and getting a lot of minor injuries. So I used it for a lot of those sort of things. Anytime, if you're using something like that, you want to clean the wound thoroughly. You want to close it the best you can before you apply anything like that, and then put that over top of it. So I don't like introducing shredded wood into wounds very much. A lot of people don't seem to have nearly the problem with it that I do, and some people don't do what I just said. But that's what I consider the best practice for it, is try and wash the wound out, close it up the best you can, and then put the people paste powder over top of it to sort of secure it and to help protect it from infection, and help to dry it up. Because if the wound is weeping, that powder will actually, that paste will actually absorb some of the fluid and so forth. I said 4 parts slippery elm to 1 part each of the golden seal and myrrh. Although you can play around with the composition a little bit if you want to. You know, it's I've tried different compositions of it, different proportions of it, and that's what I like, is 4 parts of the slippery elm to 1 part each of the other 2. And you know, just keeping it as a powder and then mixing it up with a little bit of water when I was ready to apply it to something. So anyway, that's a good trick, good herbal remedy that's been around for, I don't know, 3 generations or so now. So yeah, slippery elm can be used in savory dishes. It can be used like to thicken a soup, for instance. If you just have like strips of slippery elm and you put them in the broth, it gives it a little bit of a, it tastes like wood, you know, it has a little bit of a woody taste to it, but it's not unpleasant, and it goes along with, if it's a savory type of thing, it goes along with other flavors pretty nicely. So I've used it as a thickener in when I was making soup with wild vegetables. And you know, it's good and nourishing. It is soluble fiber, so if you're taking it in sufficient quantities, it will soften stools. It will have a very mild laxative effect. If you were to take the dried powder in capsules, it would actually absorb some water and might even have the opposite of a laxative effect, depending on how much liquid you took with it. But usually if you're taking it in tea form, it's going to have just a very mild laxative effect. If you take like 1 cup of it, you're not really even going to notice that so much. So a lot of the time I use it as a sore throat remedy. There's a commercial blend called Throat Coat Tea that contains slippery elm, among other things, that I always keep around the house. That's from Traditional Medicinals, I believe. And I gave a class a few years ago, I guess it's been 5 or 6 years ago, to Traditional Medicinals management, where I was talking about different herbs that grow around here. And they said that most or maybe even all of their slippery elm was gathered here in Kentucky.
Tried to get it here. And I don't know how to say hi to my ears. I bet Ben brought it. So I don't know how to interact with you. Like ask questions.
So yeah, so that's a really good tip. Kim mentions mixing it with applesauce, which, I mean, when you mix it with applesauce, you can't even really taste that it's in there, and it doesn't have that slimy texture, which can be off-putting to some people, is not really noticeable when it's mixed in with the applesauce, because it's already a thick semi-liquid substance. So mixing it in with applesauce is a way to give it to kids, especially for promoting bowel regularity, is a really good way to use it. A really way to make it easier to take, especially, you know, kids often will balk at taking things that have textures that they find disagreeable, even more so than tastes that they find disagreeable. So applesauce can be a really good medium for delivery for that. So that's a good tip, good thing to bring up. Thanks. Slippery elm strips can also, if you have strips, can also be used on wounds. You can have like a wet piece of slippery elm over top of a wound, and that will have, and you can, tape it in place or have it under a larger bandage or something, like adhesive bandage or something like that, or even wrap it against the wound. And that will soften the edges of the wound so that they don't dry up and scar as much. And it will help to keep the wound from becoming infected, while kind of keeping circulation to the wound good. So that can be a good thing to use on a wound or even on a scar. You can use it if you have a scar from a recent surgery or something, and you poultice slippery elm on that. It will help to keep it moist, basically, and also to keep it from being infected and keep anaerobic skin bacteria from disrupting the healing process. So it's really useful for that. And I've used that a lot for people who had incision scars from surgery, and some that were fairly recent and still in the process of healing, and sometimes with other scars as well. And it can be pretty helpful. And so that's another useful use of that particular herb. So, all right. Well, I guess that's about all I have to say about slippery elm, other than, if you are going to find it, a couple of things that you need to do is, one is to be able to distinguish slippery elm from other elm trees because it looks very similar. And the other thing is to, be able to source it in a way that's sustainable, which for me means taking one small tree from a stand of trees every several years. And so, harvesting it in a very, in a way that respects that it's a slow growing herb. It takes many, many years to grow a pound of slippery elm inner bark. That is a considerable investment on the part of the forest to grow enough slippery elm tree for there to be 1 pound of bark. Is actually, takes a lot of growing. So, it's something that you don't want to just use. You don't want to use it in situations where you could have used another source of soluble fiber or another slippery type of herb that might have worked better, like seaweed or like marshmallow. Marshmallow grows much faster, has a lot of the same medicinal properties. Not all the same medicinal properties, but some of them. It's also demulcent and anti-inflammatory and anti-infective. But so anyway, slippery elm is it's a really good herb. It is something that you do have to be respectful of and mindful of the ecological cost of using. It doesn't just come from the slippery elm factory. It comes from a long process of growth of a living thing. So keep that in mind. But at the same time, I think it's a good herb for you to know about, and for you to learn to be able to use and familiarize yourself with. And it's one that I've used a lot in my life, and especially used a lot for my own family and people close to me. It's something that, trying to source enough of it for an entire community of people, 1,000 patients or so, it's not something that I really want to use it very often. But when it's just for, the 4 people who live in my household, then that's a very different story, as far as what would be the point at which I would consider it to be an appropriate herb to use. So, this the sort of thing you should think about as a serious student of herbal medicine with any plant you're using is it available in large quantities? Is it available in small quantities? How can I source it and sustainably and ethically, and what would be guidelines for using it in the kind of quantities that are in which it's available? So I have a question here of how do you make your ginger tincture? Do you dry it? I don't dry. You can make a tincture from dry ginger, but when I'm using it, I usually get fresh ginger and make a fresh ginger tincture where I'm using half as much ginger as liquid. So if I wanted to make 3 pounds of tincture, I use 1 pound of ginger. I mean, if I wanted to make, it wouldn't actually end up being 3 pounds of tincture, but I would use a pound of ginger. If I wanted to make tincture out of a pound of ginger, I would put it in 2 pounds of alcohol and water. Usually I'd use 2 pounds of it, 20% alcohol, 80% water combination, which is, low alcohol concentration. It doesn't really need the alcohol for anything except to keep it shelf stable in this particular case. So you can make it out of dried ginger, but I wouldn't buy fresh ginger and then dry it. I like to just take the fresh ginger and chop it or grate it into small pieces, and then add twice as much liquid as the amount of ginger. And most of the ginger will actually dissolve into the liquid. You'll be left with some bark and some fibrous material at the end. But if you let it sit for about a month and you shake it vigorously, it will break up most of the actual tissue of the ginger, and you'll end up with a cloudy liquid and a little bit of leftover material. So it's kind of like you're liquefying the ginger into the tincture. But yeah, that's what I like to do is a fresh tincture with 2 parts liquid to 1 part plant material. I do add water. I add water to the alcohol, and then I add that combination of alcohol and water to the ginger. You could use straight vodka, or you could, I wouldn't use straight alcohol that was like 95% alcohol or anything, which is the highest concentration you can normally find it in. Because the water is actually doing most of the absorbing in this case. The water is actually, most of the stuff in ginger is water soluble or water dispersible. So I use a lower alcohol concentration for that. But I mix the menstruum, the liquid part of the tincture, I mix that before I add it to the ginger. You don't have to do it that way. You could add the alcohol and then the ginger and then the water if you wanted to, as long as the amounts were the same at the end. But it's just easier for me to mix up the 20% alcohol solution and then use, twice the quantity of that as I'm using of the ginger. In this case, I didn't make this one. Aoife made this one. My daughter, she's basically in charge of producing most of the medicines for the practice these days. She just sliced it into thin slices and then let it sit for longer. But like I said, a lot of the actual material from the chopped up ginger ends up in the liquid, and it should be a nice cloudy, translucent or opaque liquid, not a real not a real transparent one. If it's real transparent, you've left a lot of the stuff behind in the ginger root that could have gone into the tincture.
Would dried ginger tincture similarly to how burdock root that's dried tinctures, would they tincture kind of similar?
Yeah, fairly similar.
Okay.
Yep.
I've done the burdock root dried, never done the ginger dried. Just curious if I were not to be able to find fresh.
Yeah, it would be fairly similar. A lot of the time, if you find dried ginger, it's in the form of powder. So that's going to make some difference. Whereas burdock is almost always little chunks, and you can buy little chunks of ginger too, just depending on where you're shopping for it. Cut and sifted ginger versus powdered ginger. But yeah, for me, for my part, I find the fresh ginger easier to work with, among other things. But you can get good quality products from all of it. And like I said, people have been using ginger for a long time, and they've prepared it in just about every way you can imagine. Butter extracts and candies and all kinds of things. So the sky's the limit. Imagination is the limit.
Would ginger be okay for, like, in a tincture form to be taken for someone, say, with like a rheumatism type inflammation from an autoimmune disease or things like that? Would it be a good thing to take on a regular basis, say before bedtime or something like that?
Yeah, I often give ginger to people with autoimmune issues, with autoimmune inflammation. A lot of the time I give it in the morning rather than before bed, but it's not particularly stimulating or sedating, so either one should work.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So I got a question saying that as people age, if they have autoimmune disorders, the digestion gets more and more sensitive and less functional. Would slippery elm and ginger be good to regulate this sort of issue? Yes, they would both be helpful in that sort of situation. There are other herbs that do work on autoimmune gut inflammation. A lot of the time, for instance, if somebody had a progressive autoimmune disease that was causing destruction to their digestive system, like inflammatory bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease, a lot of the time I would use ginger or turmeric, and I would also use some steroidal anti-inflammatory herbs that increase appetite, which Trillium is one that I use a lot. Trillium is not necessarily, it's a very ecologically sensitive herb. But sometimes boswellia, which is frankincense, quite a few different ones that I would use in that sort of situation. But lots of anti-inflammatories, and then stuff to help regulate absorption or to promote absorption, because a lot of the time the capacity for absorption of nutrients is decreased in people in that type of situation. Hang on a second. As far as food allergies, with food allergies, so the demulcent part will help with bloating and gas. The slippery elm will help a lot with bloating and gas, as would other demulcent herbs like the sea moss that we talked about previously, or marshmallow. Any of those would help with that. And the slippery ones, they'll also help with, they help some with re-establishing gut flora, as does root vegetables, like I was talking about. So those are all things that can be helpful with gut flora and with bloating and gas. But as far as the inflammation caused by food allergies, really avoiding them is the most effective thing. But then a lot of the time I would use antihistamine herbs as well, like nettle. Fresh nettle extract is something that I might use in that type of a situation. But it would depend a lot on the particular person, really. There was another question whether tincture was a common way to take ginger. Yeah, it's a pretty common way to take it. Tea is a really common way to take it too. And a lot of the time, the hotness of the tea actually helps to enhance what the ginger is doing, because the ginger is a warming herb and the hot liquid is a warming physical substance. So, that's stuff that could go along with each other, that could complement each other. But tincture is a common way to take it too. And so are lots of other things, The question of whether I've ever used slippery elm as a preservative in salves. I've never used it as a preservative in salves. I have used it to help. I've used it as an emulsifying agent to get oils and non-oily things to mix together. because it is, well, like if you were to use a little bit of slippery elm and some, maybe some tincture of something and some oil and put it together in a blender, you can get like a lotion or like maybe more like a whipped mayonnaise type consistency out of it, but a creamy type consistency out of it. But I haven't really used it as a preservative, and I'm not sure how well it would work for that. It does have some antibacterial properties, but I haven't particularly tried it in that context, so I'm not sure. So there's a question of when the plant collection project is due. I would say November is kind of my suggested completion date for it, because that would be like midway, the beginning of November, which would be midway through the class, 6 months in. Although, it could be, that's not set in stone. It's more like, let me know when you have it done, and then we will look over it together. So that's kind of, go at your own pace, but that's a good time to have it done. Also, because in a lot of areas after that, there aren't going to be a lot of plants to collect until next spring. So that's kind of when we're starting to get into frost time, and when there's going to be a lot fewer plants that, not that there will be none of them, but there will be a lot fewer plants that you could potentially collect in late November or December or anything. And as far as the amount of plants, I'm suggesting at least 50 plants would be a good number. Another question that somebody asked, is there going to be another herb walk? There's going to be 2 more herb walks. I haven't set the dates for them yet. So that's, yeah, there will be a total of 4, and there have been 2 so far. All right. Okay, well, any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for coming, and I will get this video posted probably Thursday, and I'll try to include some things in the some recipes in the comment section.
Happy birthday!
Birthday blessing.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Happy
everyone.
birthday!
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Happy birthday.
Thanks. Have a good night, all.
Bye-bye.